Welcome to KRQE's New Mexico News Insiders, 2025 Regional Edward R. Murrow Award winner for Best Podcast. Here's Gabrielle Burkhart and Chris McKee.
So we've talked about ways that certain federally funded programs have been cut or threatened under the current presidential administration, but the situation that we're talking about today is likely one you have not heard about. Its impact also is really wide-reaching here in New Mexico and across the country.
Yeah, the CJA is what we're talking about. It stands for the Criminal Justice Act Panel. And those panel members are a group of attorneys who do important work on criminal cases in the federal courts nationwide. None of those attorneys have been paid since July.
But before we get into the details of why that is, what exactly they do, because it's not totally shutdown related, let's introduce our guest, attorney Ryan Villa of Albuquerque. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. First, tell us about yourself. What kind of law do you practice? What role do you have with the Criminal Justice Act panel? And what is it exactly for people who've never heard of this?
So I practice here in Albuquerque, primarily doing criminal defense. Also do civil rights work, which is unrelated to what we're talking about this morning. A big part of my practice is Criminal Justice Act cases. So cases in which individuals are charged with federal crimes and they're indigent. They can't afford to pay for an attorney, so the court appoints me as their lawyer. I'm also the Criminal Justice Act panel district representative. Every federal district in the country has a CJA panel representative who speaks on behalf of the panel and represents the panel members in a variety of functions.
I know people often hear the term public defender. Is it similar in the work that you do?
Very similar. We are sort of an adjunct or counterpart to the federal public defender. The federal public defender's office takes the primary caseload for indigent criminal defendants. They take about 60% of the cases, and CJA panel attorneys, who are private attorneys, self-employed or employed in law firms, handle the other 40%. And those are cases that the federal public defender can't take for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, so essentially a stopgap to avoid just all the work falling on the public defender's office, and also, as you mentioned, pick up some of those cases they cannot deal with for various means.
Oftentimes it's caseload for the federal public defenders or conflict of interest. In a specific case, they can only represent one person, but there's a number of other people who need representation.
Is it fair to think of it as like you guys are private attorneys kind of contracting with the federal government to take on a lot of these criminal cases in federal courts?
Exactly. That's exactly the way I think of it.
Okay.
So you're one of 52 attorneys in New Mexico, as we understand, with the CJA panel, who recently wrote and signed a letter to Chief Judge Kenneth Gonzalez in Santa Fe. This is a U.S. federal court judge. The subject line of that letter was, quote, declination of further CJA appointments. What does that mean exactly? What was that letter about?
The letter was a group of us, almost all attorneys. Many of the folks who signed the letter, some of the 52, were actually contractors. And that's one thing that the CJA also covers, is any contractor that the attorney needs to help with the case, investigators, interpreters, expert witnesses. So many of the folks who signed the letter were also contractors, maybe 10 or 15 of them. But essentially to tell the judge that until the funding issues are resolved, we are no longer going to accept appointments for CJA cases.
And can you do that?
Yes. So typically when we get an appointment, an attorney who works for the federal public defender, who's called resource counsel, it's their job to find an attorney to take the case, will call us. And if we're otherwise not able to take the case because we're busy, or we're in the middle of a trial, we're going on vacation, we have too many cases, we can say no. I think that a lot of people were already saying no because of this funding issue, what we were kind of referring to as quiet quitting. The letter was, in our view, a way to say, hey, this is why we're not taking these cases anymore. We want you to know the reasons why and to hope that we can do something about it.
Yeah, because We mentioned that this is not necessarily government shutdown related, although you've told me it's exacerbated the problem. But before we get into, that and the shutdown effects, we have to go back even before October 1, before July, really. Explain to us what's led you all to not receive a paycheck since July 3rd, 2025.
So in 2024, before October, when Congress was talking about the 2025 budget, which typically happens, and we hope that it happens by October 1st, so there's not a government shutdown, Congress declined to give the full funding that was requested by what's called Defender Services. They request the budget for the CJA as well as the Federal Public Defender. Congress intentionally underfunded the requested budget made by Defender Services. So that was for 2025 fiscal year. We were made aware of that very early on in late 2024, 2025. DSO and those that work for DSO, which includes, there's federal judges who will assist in lobbying Congress for various budget, needs, court security, CJA, public defenders, lots of things like that. We're telling Congress this isn't enough money. We're going to run out of money for 2025. And so efforts were made to provide, a stopgap, additional funds to make up for the deficit. But Congress declined to do that throughout 2025, all the way through September of this year. When Congress was there in September, they were asked to make up the shortfall for 2025. But way back in April, we were warned that we're going to have to take measures to make up for this lack of funding. And one of those measures was stopping paying CJA attorneys and contractors in July.
So you noted in this letter, this is not just about the government shutdown, as Gabby was kind of mentioning here as well. And to timestamp ourselves, where we're at recording this episode right now, the government has been shut down for 41 days. It's the longest running shutdown in U.S. history. It surpasses the 35-day record in 2019. The shutdown, though, as we're, again, recording this, it may come to an end very quickly here this week, even maybe before this episode airs. But even if it does come to a conclusion there, it won't necessarily fix everything for the CJA panel. Can you tell me about why that is?
We were told, hey, when the government gets funded again in October 1st for fiscal year 2026, we'll pay you what you haven't been paid July, August, and September out of the 2026 budget. So I believe the deficit is now close to $90 million that is owed for July, August, and September. I haven't seen the most recent numbers, but close to that figure. So they'll use the funds that become available normally in October when the government is funded to pay you for 2025. Because of the shutdown, we haven't been paid. When this continuing resolution that's now proposed comes through, there'll be funds, and they'll use those funds to pay for 2025, the 3 months that we haven't been paid. But keep in mind, folks are still working as we speak. And so there's money owed not only for 2025, but now 2026, which starts, the month of October forward. The question now becomes, is there going to be enough money to even start paying for 2026, or will it just be enough money to pay for 2025, the money that's owed?
Yeah, so there's a deficit of at least $90 million, you said.
Yeah, and that was a figure I heard a few weeks ago, so I believe it's larger now. Because, as bills come in to be paid, right, whether it's an attorney bill or a contractor bill, the deficit grows. So it may be closer to $100 million at this point. But the 2026 funding not only does not account for this deficit, it also proposes to underfund 2026. So Defender Services said to Congress before October 1st, this is how much we need for 2026, and Congress reduced that amount by almost $500 million, $495 million, which means there's not going to be enough money for 2026. We're going to be in the same situation probably earlier in the year, but also you have to use 2026 funds to pay 2025 deficits. It's really compounding the problem.
What is the feeling amongst those who are doing this work as this has gone on? I mean, it's got to be frustrating because you're caught between wanting to receive payment for the work that you're doing for your own livelihood, but also continuing to do justice and representing these cases, I imagine. So what is the feeling that you've heard maybe yourself or from other attorneys?
Very frustrating. Morale is very low. You know, attorneys who do this work aren't doing it to make lots and lots of money, right? The rates we get paid are probably half of what private market rate is. Almost everyone I know that does it here locally and across the country does it out of passion for the law, defend folks, protect the Constitution. And so then when you're not getting paid for that, not only is it frustrating, but many people rely on it heavily, not just for their own well-being, but their staff, their overhead. And there's many contractors, CJA contractors, it's almost exclusively what they do. It's a very specialized area of the law that not a lot of folks do. And it's very, very frustrating to see people you work with, day in and day out for years who have dedicated their lives to this, some of them not knowing what to do next, right? Because this is all they've done for years.
So just to get into a little bit more of what you all do, New Mexico has about 100 Criminal Justice Act or CJA attorneys, right? Nationwide, there's close to 12,000. So this impact is not just something felt in New Mexico. What has this meant for federal courtrooms across the country?
We're still seeing that play out. I think that we've seen delays. We've seen cases get delayed. We've seen cases get stayed, which is the legal term for sort of putting a case on hold indefinitely. So stayed as a result of congressional funding. Also, I think now I heard for the first time about our resource counsel, who has to find lawyers to take cases, not being able to find an attorney to take a case for a case that's going before the court this week. And so I think we're going to start seeing more and more delays in the court system, clogging of court dockets, cases get backed up. People who are expected to be in a trial for, weeks or 2 weeks, 3 weeks at a time, asking the court to delay those trials until there's funding. Because you can imagine, working for 3 weeks and not knowing when you're going to get paid for that work. So it's going to create, I think, a backlog in the courthouse, and we've started to see that already.
We'll be right back with more of the New Mexico News Insiders.
KRQE News 13 investigations. One of the biggest cons in New Mexico history. How did they get away with it?
Well, they had an accomplice. The state of New Mexico.
A road rage encounter leads to murder.
I miss him every single day.
Did the judicial system fail here?
New Mexico's families, homes, and lives are left in ashes.
There's a level of anxiety.
FEMA has been an abject and abysmal failure.
Watch anytime on krqe.com or our YouTube channel.
One of the big impacts, as we understand here, are sort of the tribal law cases. New Mexico has a lot of tribal land, and attorneys like yourself represent a lot of those defendants in the court, the CJA attorneys, where if they can't pay again for their own private attorney, the Constitution grants those folks the right to an attorney, whether that be a public attorney or a private attorney contracting with the government like the CJA attorneys yourself. We understand there are a lot of Native American defendants who fall into that group of folks who need an attorney, cannot necessarily pay for one to represent themselves. And so, again, are you seeing that right now? You had mentioned there was a case this week calling around trying to find representation and just sort of not being able to find one. That's some of the impact, it sounds like, that is happening. And I guess maybe the question is, what is the impact in the tribal environment for these cases for folks who live in tribal areas in New Mexico?
I suspect it's going to be the things we're talking about, delays, inability to get attorneys. And, it affects not just the tribal members who are charged with crimes, but also their families and the tribal members who are the victims of the crimes. So the crimes that come to federal court from Native American land, which under federal law they call it Indian country, that's the proper name for it, So we refer to them often as Indian country crimes. It's an old law, so they're still used, old terms. Are major crimes, so very serious crimes, violent crimes, petty crimes, misdemeanor crimes are handled by the tribe. But these major crimes come to federal court, and oftentimes somebody's, severely hurt or killed, or abused in some way, and everybody wants to see these cases get resolved, right? From start to finish, it's in everyone's interest, including the person charged with the crime, who's typically waiting in jail, and their family members are wanting to know what's going to happen, as well as the victims of the crime, who also want to see these cases resolved and get some measure of justice, are going to be facing delays, and I think long delays.
So let's be clear about what kinds of cases are heard in federal court, right? Because, we have metropolitan courts, we have district courts, but in federal court, these could be, like you said, violent crimes like murders, rapes, child sexual abuse. What kinds of cases are heard in federal court?
So for the cases involving the tribes, right, it would be those types of crimes, violent crimes. A typical violent crime that doesn't occur on tribal land would be handled in state court, because the federal court doesn't have jurisdiction over those, unless it's, on national park or military base or something. So the vast majority of, the rapes, the murders, sexual assaults are tribal cases that come to federal court. There are some other cases that can come to federal court when there's a violent crime. If there's a kidnapping crossing state lines, anything involving carjacking. One of the death penalty cases you guys may have heard about that was put on hold was a carjacking case out of Santa Fe. So there's limited jurisdiction for the federal government over violent crimes, but there's still a large amount of violent crimes handled in federal court. Also, drug crimes, gun crimes, the large drug trafficking crimes are primarily handled in federal court. All of those cases typically require some CJA attorney to help. A lot of the big drug cases have sometimes 10, 15 folks charged in the crime, and they're all charged together. And to get that case from start to finish, everybody needs an attorney, and oftentimes that means a CJA attorney.
So it sounds like, it's also not in just the best interest of the defendant, but the public, like for a public safety concern for these cases to be able to be adjudicated and move through the courts, and not this clogging up of the system, like you're saying, just sounds like a negative impact for all of the above.
I think it does affect public safety. Anytime we talk about, when we're talking about passing new laws or how do we address the crime problem, you look at social research on it, the primary thing that the social scientists find is that helps deter crime, just, get crime rates down, especially violent crimes, and, other crimes too, is the swiftness within which the person is prosecuted and, the case is resolved. And I'm not exactly sure why that is, but it's held true throughout social science that I've read and that I've heard talked about. And so anytime you have a delay, I think you're clearly affecting that, which then may mean, increase in crime. Other public safety concerns that could come into play are, if somebody's held in jail and they can't find an attorney to represent that person, oftentimes the remedy is release that person from jail. If that person is deemed, dangerous, then we have a problem, right? And you also talk about speedy trial rights. So the speedy trial right is, one, the defendants, the person in jail waiting for their trial. But also there's this public has a speedy trial right. When you read the Supreme Court cases that talk about what does a speedy trial right mean, they talk about the community and the public's right to a speedy trial, because the community and the victims, the family of the victims, want to see these cases resolved. And I think it's not just so that they have closure, but also, as we've seen from social science, it reduces crime.
So this is also impacting border prosecutions and federal immigration cases, which we haven't talked about yet. It's a priority of this presidential administration. How are those cases being impacted by the lack of attorneys and the lack of ability to take on federal caseloads?
That's a really big problem. It's really unique. So the majority of the border cases are handled in the Las Cruces court. And there's a large Las Cruces CJA panel of attorneys that handle those cases. A lot of those cases are, what we call illegal reentry. It means somebody who's previously been deported or removed from the country comes back into the country without permission. And many of those cases have a very short lifespan. So 60 days or 4 months from the time they're arrested until they go to court, and then they've served their time and they're being deported back to the country from which they've come from. Oftentimes for the Las Cruces case, that's Mexico or South America. So a lot of those attorneys have signed on to the letter and they're not taking cases. So that means that these folks are not getting processed the way they're normally processed, which is going to cause a number of effects, I think. One, jails get full and there's nowhere to put these individuals. Many of the jails where these individuals are being housed are also housing people who are just being detained for immigration, right? They're not charged with the crime, but they're waiting for their immigration hearing or their deportation hearing.
Civil detainees.
Exactly. So where are you going to put all these folks who don't have attorneys? And also just the effects of not prosecuting them and removing them back to the country from which they came from, I think may have an effect on, the number of people that continue to cross the border. And I'm hearing about this from not just our district, right, the Western District of El Paso, the Western District of Texas, which is El Paso and Arizona. Between those three, New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, is sort of the largest group of CJA attorneys that represent folks who are being charged with these border crimes. And I think it's going to really impact the administration's ability to do what it wants to do at the border.
Do you think that problem is fully understood in Washington?
No. I think if it was, they'd be funding us. But, I haven't heard President Trump or somebody from the White House really talking about the funding issues. I know Congress has voted against making up the 2025 deficit, increasing additional funds, but I have not heard, that's coming from the White House, as oftentimes Congress does things, at the president's request. I think if the president recognized that this was going to impact his ability to do what he wanted to do at the border, and he told Congress, fund the CJA, I think it would happen.
Some people ultimately are going to listen to this and they may think, why should I care about a private attorney who's not getting paid? They probably make way more than I do anyway, right? You mentioned rates on the private market are higher, but CJA rates, of course, are about half of as what you were mentioning. People may believe something along those lines, right? This has a trickle-down effect, as you mentioned, though, on staff members working in the offices. Also, criminal cases that are pending in court might get stayed, delayed. If attorneys aren't taking cases or just cannot take on criminal cases, does this mean criminal cases in the federal court stand the potential to be thrown out, though, as well? You mentioned the delays, but are there chances that maybe we run into some of the issues that we've seen locally here in Bernalillo County of the wait being for so long, somebody pending trial, that the case just goes away, essentially?
Absolutely. Motions, requests to the court, motions of what we call them, have already been filed in this district to dismiss cases because of the lack of funding. So there's this, the Sixth Amendment to the Constitution is what requires the court to provide somebody an attorney and provide a defense and pay for that defense. So folks are filing motions to dismiss, saying Congress is violating the Sixth Amendment rights of these defendants. The court hasn't dismissed a case that I've heard about in New Mexico or in the country, but I think it will get to that point when, like I found out this week, they couldn't find an attorney to take a case. Eventually these cases are going to get backed up and, to a point where they can't get attorneys to take them, or they can't get, the contractors that are needed, expert witnesses, contractors, investigators, that a court's going to have no choice but to dismiss a case.
We'll be right back with more on New Mexico News Insiders.
Hey guys, Chad Brummett here with New Mexico Frontiers, the KRQE original series that focuses on tech and innovation happening right here in New Mexico. We've got a lot of great stories about various businesses, technology, and of course space exploration. So make sure that you follow us on air at KRQE and Fox New Mexico, as well as our KRQE YouTube channel online. In the meantime, let's get back to the New Mexico News Insiders.
You mentioned that what makes this different than any other federally funded programs in the news cycle, for example, like SNAP or grant programs or even healthcare, right? This speaks to a constitutional right that people have. Can you explain what makes this situation so unique?
It's exactly that. There's a constitutional right to a defense, and there's a constitutional right to a paid defense if you're indigent. So in Gideon versus Wainwright is the famous Supreme Court case that says you're entitled to an attorney. There are cases that came after Gideon from the U.S. Supreme Court that said if you can't afford it, the state has to pay for it, or the government has to pay for your attorney. And then other cases from the Supreme Court, not only do you have to pay for the attorney, but also any necessary, expert witness, investigator, things like that. So it's constitutionally required as interpreted by our U.S. Supreme Court. These other things you speak of, SNAP, Medicaid, there's no constitutional right. Whether we think there should be or whether we think Congress should provide funding for these things, there's no constitutional right to it. So Congress could make a policy choice that we're not going to have food stamps, we're not going to have health care. And we might agree, we might disagree with that, but the courts can't force Congress to do that. Here, though, because there's a constitutional right, the courts can force Congress to do that in various ways, right? I mean, the court can't tell Congress what to do or not to do in terms of funding, but it can dismiss cases or stop prosecutions until funding is authorized by Congress.
Wow. So we mentioned, of course, this letter. It's been signed by 52 attorneys across New Mexico saying they're not going to take these cases anymore until the situation is resolved. What would fix the situation?
Congress funding the CJA, and they can do that. There's mechanisms to do that. It's called an anomaly, or essentially a stopgap appropriation that's outside of the normal, either a full budget bill or a continuing resolution. So, they can say, hey, we have a $100 million deficit for 2025. Please approve this anomaly of $100 million to make up the deficit. And that would solve 2025. And then 2026, please fund us at the full amount that has been requested, instead of $495 million less. And the problem would be fixed. Congress was asked twice to do this. In July, when, if you recall, Speaker of the House Johnson sent everybody home because there was the big, to-do about Epstein and the Epstein files. And so they didn't get to vote on the anomaly. And then in September, before Congress recessed for the fiscal year, they were again asked to approve an anomaly. And there was in a subcommittee, it was voted down by every single member who was a Republican in the subcommittee. So the anomaly didn't get out of the subcommittee to be approved. If they approved an anomaly for 2025 and approved full funding for 2026, problem would be solved.
We've seen a lot of divisive politics this year, but this issue, particularly when you speak to the constitutionality of it and, how it has to do with criminal justice and public safety, do you see this funding the CJA as a Republican or Democrat issue, or do you see it as more bipartisan historically?
Historically, it's been bipartisan, and I think it should be bipartisan. Crime affects everybody, Republican, Democrat alike. We all have an interest, I think, in seeing the criminal justice system function properly. Why it's a Republican versus Democrat issue now, I can only speculate, but having to do with the Republican kind of move towards less government, not spending as much money on federal government programs, allowing the states to do those sorts of things, cutting in foreign aid, cutting in Medicaid, that along those lines. And so I think perhaps it's just a lack of education or understanding of this particular issue. Is not one in which you can decide, we'll let the states handle it because this isn't something the states can handle. Or, we can just have less public CJA defenders, right? We can have less attorneys handling these cases. And so we'll just cut the funding, and that will, just like in the Environment Department or other departments of the federal government where you see folks are getting fired, laid off, and not being brought back. You can't do that in the criminal justice system if you're going to continue prosecuting cases at the same level. If you reduce prosecutions, then sure, you can have less CJA attorneys. But if you increase prosecutions, which is exactly what the Trump administration has done, then you have to fund sufficient numbers of CJA attorneys. So keep in mind the big, beautiful bill, Congress approved at President Trump's request $2 billion for the Department of Justice, the highest amount of money that they've provided for the Department of Justice. And that is so that they can carry out the president's policies, prosecutions at the border, increase in death penalty, capital prosecutions, prosecuting transnational drug organizations, all policy decisions that Congress can make, that the president can make, and regardless of how you feel about it. If you're going to have an increase in those types of prosecutions, you have to, at the same time, fund the defense.
Yeah, interesting. Well, by speaking up here in New Mexico, as we mentioned, this is a nationwide issue, and you see this more as probably quiet quitting in other, maybe states going on. Are you hopeful that other attorneys across the country will speak up about this issue, or maybe that people will just become more educated about what's going on about this particular program?
I'm certainly hopeful that other CJA panels throughout the country will follow along with what we're doing, because we believe this will get the message to Congress and the Trump administration that, hey, you got to fund us. We're not taking a stand on the prosecutions they're bringing, whether we think the border prosecutions are appropriate or not. Increase in capital prosecutions. This isn't about that. This is about, you have to fund us in order to have a functioning federal criminal justice system. So I think if other panels throughout the country do that, because I know there's quiet quitting. I've talked to the CJA panel representatives in other districts. We all communicate with one another, and they talk about how percentages of their panel are no longer taking cases. And so I believe that is because of quiet quitting. But I think if they spoke out and told Congress and told the administration why, that it would bring light to this issue.
Oh.
Anything else we're missing that you want to add or want people to better understand?
I don't think so. I feel like we've covered the issues.
It, yeah.
But like I said, I mean, you asked a question, and a lot of people have asked me this. Why should we care about some attorney
getting paid?
And it's really less about us than it is about the folks involved in the cases, right? The defendants, their families, the victims, their families, and the contractors who do this CJA work. And who get paid, less than attorneys often, as well as, our staff. And I mean, look, we can move on and take other cases. We could adapt and learn to do different work and to make up for the loss of money that we're getting from the CJA cases. But then that means someone else has to step up. And I don't know any attorneys who would want to step up and take a case where they're not going to get paid. I think that so I worked for Chief Justice Boston of the New Mexico Supreme Court, and there was a funding crisis for the state public defenders back in 2005 when I worked for him, and he used to talk about it as a three-legged stool. The criminal justice system is a three-legged stool. One leg is the courts, one leg is the prosecution, the other leg is the defense. And all three have to be functioning fully and equally for the criminal justice system to work.
Okay. Well, Ryan Villa, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me.
A quick update since we recorded our interview with attorney Ryan Villa. Obviously, the government shutdown did come to an end after a record-setting 43 days, so I checked back in with him. He says his firm has been paid a significant amount of past due payments, and his understanding is that a lot of those past due payments are being made nationwide. On one hand, Congress has approved an anomaly to pay those past due amounts, but on the other hand, Villa points out they still have not fully funded 2026, meaning they can once again be in this position next year. So how this panel of attorneys will move forward with the ability to take on more federal cases is still unclear. We really appreciate the insight he provided into this issue. It's certainly one we had not heard of until they had written that letter. If you have any ideas or anyone you'd like to hear from on our show, always feel free and reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhart@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening and watching.